Nancy, it covers national security and the Department of National Security for over 2 decades. She's been a foreign correspondent based in Iraq and Egypt and has reported all across the Middle East. But of course, the most important part of her CV is is a graduate of the University of Virginia.
That's exactly right.
Nice.
Well,
Who knew, right?
all right. It's a
Other to talk about specifically, we're talking about what's been happening in Venezuela, what's happening with Pete Hegseth. We've got a lot to cover there. So basically, you just start by giving us the latest, Nancy, on Venezuela, on the strange briefing that took place at the Pentagon today, and what they're saying about this second order to strike survivors of one of these boat strikes. And then we'll talk about other stuff after that.
okay. So let's start with sort of Venezuela broadly. Starting September 2nd, the United States has been striking boats operating near there, initially saying that they were going after drug trafficking and stopping drugs from entering the United States. The problem is those boats didn't have the capability to reach the United States directly. Many of them were headed to Trinidad and Tobago with the intent to go to Europe. Venezuela is not a big trafficker of fentanyl. That's China, Mexico. And so over time, it shifted towards a potential regime change effort. And so we've had these mounting U.S. military presence. There are more ships in the region than since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as a military setup, we have too many troops to just go after more boats, not enough troops for regime change. And so we're sort of in this holding pattern that's been going on for weeks, so much so that you have the USS Gerald Ford, the aircraft carrier based there. It's been there for weeks. And so in the middle of all this,
Ability is now outside Venezuela, right?
I'm sorry, say that again. The sound cut off.
I hope everyone can hear me. Are we having sound problems?
Yeah, let me hold it.
Okay, 15% I said of the US military is currently stationed somewhere in the vicinity of Venezuela.
So I don't know their percentage, but it's at least a dozen ships, including an aircraft carrier. There are Marines nearby. There are bombers nearby. We've got troops in Puerto Rico. It's an extraordinary military footprint in the region for, as of yet, not a clear stated mission in terms of what is the imminent threat that requires a potential U.S. military intervention. So in the middle of all this, the Washington Post had a really important story in which they said that for that first strike, remember there have been 21, I think, it's hard to keep count of all of them, 21
Right.
strikes on boats. The first one, the U.S. did what's called the double tap, that they hit the boat twice. And the reason this is such a big deal, the second strike, I would argue they're both a big deal, but the second one in particular is under the Geneva Conventions, there's this thing called Common Article 3. And what it says is you can't go after someone who's out of combat. So think of someone waving a white flag or wounded, that once they're sort of not a threat, you can't keep hitting them. In the sea, that means if a ship has been sort of taken out, you can't then hit it again. And the charge is that the Secretary of Defense, or War as he likes to be called, told the commanders kill them all, and that the now SOCOM commander, Special Operations Commander, took that order and hit that boat twice. And so if described accurately, that's a war crime. And that's why it's become such a big deal. Now, Hegseth the day after said he watched it from beginning to end. Today he said, actually, I just watched the first strike and then I had meetings. And that's sort of
it's all
where we are.
very murky, Nancy, because I know the New York Times has not confirmed what two sources told the reporters at the Washington Post, that Pete Hegseth had in fact kind of issued an order for the second strike, basically saying, in essence, kill them all, right?
Right.
And there were two survivors hanging off the side of this boat that
That's right.
initially been struck. And as you mentioned, it's so significant because it would be considered a war crime. And in fact, members of Congress have said that they want to have hearings about this. I think Jack Reed and Republican members of
That's right.
Congress are feeling increasingly uncomfortable about this entire operation. Yeah, and I would love to know from you, Nancy, and I was talking to David Sanger about this for this week's podcast about sort of the lack of transparency in this whole operation in terms of really proving that these boats contain drugs, that they were on a mission to transport these drugs somewhere where they would ultimately perhaps end up in the United States. There has not been any evidence that they contain drugs, has there?
No, we've never gotten a name, what kind of drugs they were carrying. They will say that they're tied to certain organizations, but we don't know why these specific boats need to be hit other rather relative to the hundreds that are operating in the region. And in fact, when two survived a later strike, one was from Colombia, one was from Ecuador, they were released to their countries. The U.S. has described them as sort of narco terrorists, that they're combatants. Well, we didn't release suspected Al Qaeda; we detained them. And yet, when the later survivors um, were released, they went back to their home countries. We don't even know what kind of ordnance was used or what units are carrying them out. Is this a drone flying off of I don't know, a destroyer nearby, or is it one being operated by somebody in Nevada where there's an airbase? We don't know those kinds of details, so it's hard to determine why these strikes are essential and what they're protecting the United States from, particularly since we know that fentanyl doesn't come through those waters, that the boats that they're hitting cannot possibly reach the shores of the United States. They'd have to make multiple, they just can't hold enough fuel. So, what is it about these boats that required U.S. military intervention, lethal U.S. Military intervention 21 times?
I know that you wrote in a November piece for The Atlantic, as a justification for using military force, the drug rationale was awfully thin. Venezuela is not an important player in drug production, even though it allows cartels to use the country as a transit point. So, even if they're not an important, I mean, just to play devil's advocate, Nancy, even if they're not an important player in drug production, isn't it a bad look for Venezuela to allow cartels to use that country as a transit point? I know that there's no evidence that the drugs were on the boat, but let's say it does come to light that these were drug runners and that these boats were full of drugs.
100%. Nobody's a saint in this situation, right? I mean, Venezuela, in terms of governance, you have a leader there who won't leave power. You have drug money going through there in a very aggressive way. You have scores of armed groups operating there. It is a badly governed country. I'm asking it as sort of a reporter for the Pentagon. Why does this require this sort of bad actor require
Right.
U.S. military intervention to this scale, lethal strikes? In the past, when there have been drug boats operating, we have not used the military in this way. We have used um, the Coast Guard. We've put them under in sort of a police function, just like when people commit crimes here, we've detained them, and that's no longer happening. We're sort of we're judge and jury with these strikes. If they've done something wrong, we have the capacity to detain them. Why now does it require lethal force? The Trump administration would say because that strategy hasn't worked. If this is such a national security threat, why isn't there congressional authorization for it?
Right. And so why I mean, I'm curious, you've been covering this from the beginning, right? With this started in September. Why do you think they're doing this, Nancy?
I think the president has had a real interest in going after drug trafficking all the way back to his first term. Mark Esper wrote in his book about this. I think it's personal for him in the sense that he sees this as a problem and he wants to show that he's going after a very serious problem. So there's that interest. Marco Rubio, who's Secretary of State, has a very personal interest in this. He wants to see the end of the Maduro regime. He wants to see the opposition rise and for a democratic Venezuela to emerge because that only not only makes Venezuela stronger, but it makes Cuba stronger.
Right.
And then you have the Stephen Millers who see these kinds of strikes as sort of sending a tough message, part of their sort of counter immigration strategy. So it's like a Venn diagram where the strikes sort of fall in the middle and can and sort of meet various people's interests. That's been my sense of it, in talking to people around Washington about it.
Right. It's kind of a confluence of things that are all leading to this action. But you didn't mention that Venezuela has very significant oil reserves, right? So tell us about the role that's playing in this military action and this whole idea of regime change.
So we've heard from some officials that, if the U.S. were to be able to lead the fall of the Maduro regime, those who take over would have would owe a lot to the United States, and that there's some hope that the U.S. can sort of take advantage of the oil reserves there, which are the largest in this area by far, one of the largest in the world. We already have Shell as the primary company operating there, and that would not only cut off a resource for the Venezuelan regime, but potentially be an economic opportunity for the United States. The other thing I could mention, and I probably should, is Venezuela also is allied with China, with
Right.
Russia. And so Venezuela has been a means for rival countries to the United States to have a footprint in this hemisphere. And the fall of the Maduro regime, and this started under Chavez, by the way, but the fall of that regime could lead to the fall of those alliances that allow them to pose economic threats in the case of China, or to prop up the regime militarily in the case of Russia. Those would collapse in the event that the Maduro regime falls. But that's a very, very, very big if. And more than that, even if he falls, the prospect of instability is huge. There are so many rival groups. You would have the Venezuelan military, many of them loyal to Maduro, who would fight. You'd have ELN, you'd have FARC, you'd have Venezuelans themselves who are armed fighting for control of this country, which is much bigger than Iraq, much more complicated, and we haven't heard a clear next day plan. Who precisely takes over? What does governance look like?
Right.
And
There's not
so,
a there's not an exit strategy, but there's not a what's next strategy.
yeah,
And by the way, I just looked up, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world with approximately 303 billion barrels, a
yeah,
significant portion of which is heavy crude oil found in the Orinoco Belt, wherever
I
that is.
thought that, but I was afraid to say it officially.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your reporting at the Pentagon when you all asked for evidence and transparency about what they're finding on these boats, about the intelligence that is telling them that they need to bomb these boats with these people on them. What are you being told at the Pentagon?
Nothing. I mean, you can't get answers to very basic questions. It's You can call various. There is no official answer other than we refer you to the White House. They pose a threat. These very general statements, but every it's very suspicious when very specific questions are met with very general answers, and that's the experience we're having. That we can't get to the level of specificity that I think the American public are entitled to when you have this level of U.S. military commitment and the prospect of a very serious intervention. You can't get those answers. Those who know often are afraid to say something, and those who are authorized to speak are talking in generalities. So it's remarkable that we don't have those answers, and it's not just the press. Congress can't get those answers.
Well, that's why
So
they're holding these hearings, right?
that's right. That's one reason. And like we're we don't know the names of who we've hit. We don't know why these boats. I don't know who in the military conducted it. It's not even clear the chain of command in terms of who authorized it. But we do have signs that there's real division over this. The U.S. Southern Command commander, who's in charge of operations in this region, Admiral Halsey, announced his resignation. You've seen a number of
That
generals
was
in
a
the.
while ago, right? I
That's
think.
oh, so that's right. He announced it in October. His last day is December 12th. He hasn't given a reason, but we know from our own reporting that he raised some concerns. We've seen people in the Joint Staff pushed out, some of them, according to our reporting, for raising questions. So we do know that this has been a divisive issue among the military rank, um, about the conduct of these strikes. But do we know how the discourse happened? No. The other thing I should note is, like, in the past, and I'm not saying that everything was great when they did it back then, but there were lower level meetings, mid level meetings, high level meetings. That's not happening here. Those who are making the decisions or are part of the conversation, in some cases, are just a handful. And so it's hard to even find people who could get around these walls that the Pentagon has put up and the administration writ large because so few people know.
So are they using the boat strikes as a rationale, saying Maduro is involved in this sort of drug ring or whatever, this cartel, and ergo, if they're doing that and to kind of push him out? Is that sort of the connection? Because I'm having a hard time, honestly. It's like so complicated and convoluted understanding how these boat strikes are setting up a way to have regime change in Venezuela. Can you help me with that?
I'll try, but it's such a great question and one I keep asking as well. Because this started as we're going after fentanyl. When everyone said there wasn't fentanyl, we sort of backed our way into regime change. I mean, I don't mean to make this about Iraq, but with Iraq, the US said the goal was regime change. We didn't start there. We started with this is a drug problem, and then we sort of backed our way into regime change. I think the thinking was that these strikes would signal that the United States is in the region and ready to attack, that would lead to sort of defections and
And
people
that
trying to.
Maduro would get all nervous and
That's right.
freaked out, and
That's
that
right.
he would resign
Raise his hand and
voluntarily.
say, "I'm out," right?
Yeah.
And that would lead to some process. But, the last time we saw sort of a threat to the Maduro regime was 2019, and in that case, we saw hundreds of defections. We are not seeing that in this case. So, if that was the sort of intended domino effect, that has not manifested as of yet.
Someone was asking if there's any scenario in which Venezuela would retaliate. I mean, are I mean, can you see any kind of military action on their behalf?
No, I mean, they have limited capability to, defend themselves. They have Russian S-300s and other capabilities. We don't know how well maintained they are. I don't think you see a scenario where they're directly threatening our forces, maybe shooting down drones or things of that sort.
Right.
To me, the bigger threat in all this is that we lose partnerships to actually go after the drug problem. You've heard from, for example, Colombia's president, his frustration about the way the United States is conducting these strikes. You hear regional sort of angst over this approach. We've heard from European allies that they're not as comfortable sharing intel, particularly from the United Kingdom, that the prospect of strikes and this military presence and trying to tip the regime over and do these boat strikes is potentially undermining what its stated purpose is, which is to stop drugs from coming into the country.
By alienating some of our partners in that effort. Someone
That's right.
from Social wanted you to explain what narco terrorists are, as well as the Trump administration obsession with Tren de Aragua, which I guess is the cartel that they're obsessed with. I help me out. I don't know the answer to either of those questions. So
So I think narco terrorism is it's someone who's trafficking drugs. I think the reason you're hearing that term is it assigns terminology we're used to associating with conduct of war, that they're combatants, that they're threatening the United States. And I think that's why you've seen this sort of introduced into the lexicon. And your listener is right. The first day of his administration, he named that group as a terrorist organization. And I think part of that was an effort to say this is a threat to the United States. If they're a terror group, therefore we can hit them. The problem is the designation of anybody as a foreign terrorist organization by itself doesn't give the administration permission to conduct strikes. It's that usually it's sort of how we resource ways to go after it, financing limitations we put on it. It's not a short way trip to declaring war, but I think that's where that has come from, because it gives them permission to sort of say this is a threat that we need to go after because it's a terrorist group, and we have designated it officially as such.
and Paula, hi Paula, said, how did Trump justify pardoning the ex-president of Honduras if he's so interested in going after drug dealers? And of course, a lot of people are asking that question.
Yeah, Paul is asking the right question because in the middle of all this, he today, former president of Honduras, was released from prison after being convicted for being a massive drug trafficker of cocaine into the United States, an investigation that started under his first term. And his justification is that, like other people he knows, that this was the government going after a leader, and that he thought that that was unfair. But publicly, they make it that their explanation is, well, Trump is both tough on terrorism and tough on sort of vengeful prosecution, and so therefore it's above board.
Yeah, I know Roger Stone kind of was his big champion to get him pardoned. Um, so I can't remember if you answered this, so sorry, Nancy, if I'm asking you again. So this whole controversy in the Washington Post that Pete Hegseth, who would make him responsible, a war criminal, I guess, if what you were saying about the Geneva Convention and the U.S. Code of Military Conduct, et cetera, if he had ordered that second strike, that he'd be in some serious hot water. Now you're saying he said he didn't. I know the New York Times didn't confirm that reporting. How about you? Have you gotten any more clarity on the chain of events? Because I know that I heard Seth Moulton last night saying that they were they were throwing the military guy under the bus, that they were blaming him for this second strike. So have you been able to report that out at all?
So I want to address that because Moulton makes an important point, which is after this all came out, the secretary puts out a tweet that says, "We stand behind our generals," and Admiral Bradley, who's in charge of Special Operations Command now, and it was the JSOC commander for these strikes. We defend his conduct of war. So appearing to stand by him, but not really, actually sort of putting the onus on him. To me, I what troubles there's so much focus on what the secretary knew, but or what he ordered, but the reality is, and maybe it's just from being around the Pentagon so much, every military commander knows to not follow an illegal order, and if y the idea of hitting someone out of combat, that's not some, like, you have to get to the rank of, like, general to know that that's a problem. That is something ingrained in military commanders from a very, very early stage. And so, um, my question is, in some ways, why the military? Because we talk about Admiral Bradley, but there were a lot of people who would have known about that, who would have been aware of that decision. Where were all they? Where was General Kane? Where was Admiral Halsey? Where was Admiral Bradley in all this? Um, Even if the secretary said it, that in and of itself doesn't absolve them of the responsibility to say, "No, we can't do this." And so, for me personally, I'm just trying to figure out that part of it. The challenge with Hegseth is, in this department, things are often only communicated verbally. So we're so used to usually there'd be an order with specifics on how to conduct things. That doesn't exist here. And so it's hard to kind of get with certainty, like, who said what when. Presumably, there is a written order in terms of how the military conducts things, and so that's where my focus is on, is trying to piece that part of it together.
So much of the structure that I knew as a Pentagon reporter and that you've known for what, 18 years, right, covering the building, has been kind of removed. And the protocol that the military followed, especially in these situations, seems to have, I don't know, deteriorated or been gotten rid of altogether. No?
Yes, it's amazing. I mean, it I mean, you know better than I do. Like, it used to be there was a a a chain of command for every kind of order. You could follow a paper trail for weeks, months, years. I mean, that doesn't exist anymore. This is sort of a coterie of people kind of making decisions and sending them down. On top of that, you have a military that's frankly discouraged now people to speak up. Up until this point, the idea was if you felt something was wrong, you had a responsibility for your rank and your command to say something. But what's happened instead is we've seen a number of generals and admirals leave or be pushed out, all the way back to the chairman in February. Um, and the message that I think I hear from officers all the time is it is dangerous to speak up. And the other thing is military lawyers have been largely eliminated. You'll hear you heard reference in the White House, well, every military lawyer approved it. I don't know how many that is because they're not there in the same numbers. The day that CQ Brown, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was fired, so were several top military lawyers. So all of that has made it a climate where people are afraid to speak up and say, "This is wrong," because they have seen the consequences of it. Trump administration trying to shut
Yeah.
and
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about, it's so interesting because tell me, again, the name of the officer. I was just trying to look him up, who they're now blaming for the second strike or attributing the second strike to.
Admiral Mitch Bradley, his first name is Frank, though, so Frank M. Bradley, but he goes by Mitch Bradley.
Okay, so I think this is so interesting because this is exactly what Mark Kelly was talking about when he did that video with other members of Congress who had served in the military, right?
That's right.
And then the administration, Trump himself, I think Chart was saying it was seditious, right? Uh
They should
and
be hanged.
right. And so it's interesting because this admiral, I think what they were saying is you have the right to refuse to follow orders if they go against the military code of justice, right?
Right. So, you know what I found interesting is Karen Levitt at the time, the White House spokesperson, said when the video came out, "Well, there's been no example of an illegal order." And then a few days later, maybe there is one. If we don't know, if I'm Admiral Bradley, it could have been. I'll give you an alternative scenario. Sometimes when they do strikes in the sea, they'll hit something, a ship over and over again so that it's not sort of a threat to other ships. Was being attempted? Did they not see the civilians? Was there some confusion? We don't know. But my point is that admiral knew that hitting wounded people on a ship that's been all but destroyed is not allowed. It is out of combat. You can't do it. He knew that. That you can't say to me he wasn't aware of that. That is as if I mean, you can't get to that rank with it. You can't get to the rank of captain without knowing that. He knew it was wrong. And so did he feel the pressure? Look, he was a 3-star at the time that the strike happened, trying to get to a 4-star rank. Did he feel pressure that way? Is there some misunderstanding? I should also note he's a Navy SEAL, and that is relevant in all this because Navy SEALs do things differently than the rest of us. Like Navy SEALs are an enigma to the big Navy because they do
Mhm.
things so differently, and they're used to operating in a more
I would say
loose
clandestine
interpretation. Yeah,
or or
clandestine.
clandestine
That's
sort
right.
of situation.
Where
Yeah.
there's not a spotlight on their decisions and how they operate, and I wanna be clear, like, these kinds of things very likely happened in the Middle East as well, where people were making, decisions that one would argue are war crimes. I'm not justifying anything that's happened here. My point is, when the spotlight's not on these, we don't know what these guys do. They're used to not being sort of publicly examined the way big Navy is or an infantry, commander is. So, was that a factor in all this? At the minimum, we know that he was following the sentiment of the Secretary of Defense because all the way back to the time that he was a Fox News commentator, he has said that there are too many restrictions on the military, too many stupid rules of engagement, which is a phrase he used when he spoke to troops on September 30th. In his book, he wrote about this. Um, he argued for people charged with these kinds of crimes to be pardoned essentially by the president because he says we're putting too many restrictions on people operating on war.
I
So
remember that. I
yeah,
remember that. In fact, there was one particular case that he was very outspoken about,
Eddie
right?
Gallagher, that's right.
Yes,
So
yes.
this has been a theme of his that the rules of engagement are stupid and we're not going to. He said it to the generals and admirals on September 30th when he spoke to them at Quantico. So did he say kill them or not? I haven't. I can't. I'm not. I think the Washington Post has superb reporting, and I'm not questioning it. I don't have it independently. He has certainly expressed that sentiment during his tenure and
Right.
even before.
Like too many guardrails, right? In terms of military action. So today, I guess there was a big press conference. I think, was that where he said it was the decision was made in the fog of war, or was that earlier at a White House
That
thing?
that that was at the White House. So earlier, we got kicked out of the Pentagon because we wouldn't sign rules that said that we wouldn't publish anything that wasn't approved by the building,
Which is,
basically.
by the way, so disgusting and
Right.
outrageous and just unbelievable. And I'm so glad that everybody walked out and basically told them to pound sand and that you're covering them aggressively just outside of the building. But it is a hindrance because a lot of your sources are in the building, but now they're too afraid to talk to reporters because of the edict that came down from Pete Hegseth et
Right.
al. But anyway, so
So
that
they
is
found their own alternative press corps today, and they had their first press conference there.
right. So Laura Loomer was there and Matt Gaetz and all
That's right.
these people who normally would not. What was that about? What a freak show. It's like the
Well,
Star Wars bar.
I mean, it felt like, it was like, you're like, it's like watching like an alternative version of yourself. Like, I remember sitting, like, it was the wildest thing. But, I can tell you, I reported out many of those reporters provided their questions to the Pentagon before. So it was also very performative. And these questions, like, they have signed an agreement that says they will not publish anything that the Pentagon doesn't sign off on or agree to, and that the publication of information, even unclassified information that is not blessed by the Pentagon, could pose a national security threat. So how forceful can they be in their questions, right?
And by the way, and giving them in advance, I mean, every American should be so outraged about what is happening at the Pentagon to the Pentagon press corps, how it's infringing on our First Amendment rights. I am so ripshit about this, Nancy, and I can't believe more people aren't, really, raising hell about this.
You know what I found wild about it? What scares me personally, because I obviously agree, you're starting to see these sort of 2 tiers of information, right? It's the same event, the September 2nd strikes, and it's literally 2 vastly different versions, right? It's 2 different universes in terms of what happened, and I worry about how do people consume information in that space? And I'm not saying my version is right and you have to stick with mine, but that
Well, I
we're
think you're a
disagreeing.
good reporter. You work for The Atlantic, and I think you do fact-based journalism and not propaganda.
That's right. But, I could maybe I'm approaching it wrong. I don't know, but my point is, like, we now have a disagreement on just basics. You watch that press conference, it's a totally different world where the questions are, why are your here's a question that came out of there. Why are the Republicans going after Hegseth on this issue again? And, like, if you are of a certain political background, you're gonna see the actions that the US military is doing in a fundamentally different way than if you're reading the Washington Post. It's not just sort of a different approach. It's different facts. It's different data. It's different, and literally they're now having press briefings that we're not invited to. It's literally
It's like a
two spheres.
parallel universe,
That's right.
honestly. And and you wonder why Americans are so divided. They're getting their information from
Right.
2 very different versions of events, and it's crazy. Um, do you
Can I
think
just jump in?
yeah,
The other thing
please.
is, it's an $850 billion budget. It's an $850 billion budget. At a most basic level, those guys who are in charge of something as consequential as sending American troops into harm's way should be able to take questions they don't like, questions they think are unfair, questions they think they're obnoxious. I don't have any sympathy for the press is so unfair. I don't wanna it's such an awesome responsibility, and it's playing out right now. We as a nation don't know with clarity why US troops are potentially gonna strike into Venezuela. What is the vital national interest? What does the post period look like? And there's not even an opportunity to ask. One press conference from a press secretary where you're not even allowed to ask follow-up questions because you didn't really hear any. There are a couple, but not really, doesn't lend itself to the kind of vigorous conversation that should be
Of
happening,
course.
you know?
Were you able to ask a question at this press conference?
We weren't allowed to go.
Oh, you weren't even allowed to go.
No, we're not credentialed. We didn't sign the pledge.
Oh God, that is so unbelievable. But hey, in closing, because I'm gonna hop over to
Oh, I'm sorry.
Instagram and no, 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 you've been amazing. I'm gonna hop over to Instagram and try to raise some money for Stand Up to Cancer. This is my
Oh,
like
great.
from Venezuela to cancer research. But so if you guys want to join me in a minute, please do. But because it's Giving Tuesday. But I guess the question, Nancy, do you think? Well, I'm sure you will because you're an incredible reporter. There are great reporters covering the Pentagon, some of the smartest, most, um, committed and diligent people I've ever met, at least back in when I was covering it. I'm sure the same is true today. So the question is, given the 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 barriers they've erected for good journalism, do you think? I mean, we are going to get to the bottom of this, are we not?
Yes, it's just harder. I just wanna tell you, I'm so proud of this press corps. Since we call it the eviction, since the eviction on October 15th, there has been a consequential scoop by one of us every single few days since. How did we know that the Ecuadorian and Colombian survived one of the strikes? Reuters broke it. How did we know about the double tap strikes? The Washington Post reported. There has been amazing journalism. I'm here to tell you it is much, much harder, and I think things come out slower than they would have otherwise, and you're talking to sources who, I've been on the beat a long time, people you've known for years and years who literally say, "Don't call me, Nancy," because they're scared. You're working a lot harder for basic facts. But I love this press corps because it's been really committed to it. Like, I always say we're the geeks of Washington. Like nobody cares. Nobody cared until this year what we did. We
That's not
need to.
true.
Well, but I mean, like, we're not on TV. Our press briefings aren't that exciting. Like, we lose our minds if you say F-15 versus F-16. Like, we're geeks. And we like that. The commitment of this press corps has been phenomenal. And, you know, it's something we all believe in. Many of us have literally been ready to die for this job because we believe so much the public's right to know. And so we'll get there. It's going to take a lot longer. And the question becomes what happens in that period? Every day I ask myself, what are we missing? Because what we find is so consequential. You can't help but ask, what am I not getting every
Right.
day?
Right, right. And I'm sure there's a lot, but can I just say on behalf of everyone watching how grateful we are
Well,
to
thank you.
you and other members of the press corps at the Pentagon and how much we really value and it kind of makes me cry, value and appreciate your reporting under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for pushing. Thank you for hanging in there. Thank you for giving them hell, and for asking the tough questions because that's what you're there for. And I mean, the idea that they can't tolerate that is such an indictment. I mean, talk about a lack of courage at the Department of Defense that they can't even handle reporters asking tough questions. Honestly, that is just pathetic.
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving us a platform to talk about this. I'll tell you, when we did this, we didn't think anyone would notice as much as they did, and the support that we've gotten has been really incredible. We really did it because we believed in it, and that we've heard from so many wonderful people, including you and your very kind words. It's really helped us kind of keep going because there's some days you're like, oh, I don't know if I have the fight in me, and is it worth it? And then you get these little boosts of support that kind of keep you going. So I just want you to know how much those words mean to me and to the press corps, because there are some days where like it's
Well,
tough.
you're doing a great job. I love The Atlantic.
Well, thank
I'm
you.
such a fan of the magazine and the work you do. I've been reading your pieces. They're just excellent. It must be that
Thank you.
UVA education, Nancy.
That's all it is. I'd be nowhere without Thomas Jefferson.
Anyway, I hope that you and I can continue to chat and keep breaking those
Anytime,
stories and keep asking those questions.
anytime. I've loved the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Nancy, and thanks everyone for watching. I'm going to Instagram. Join me there if you get a chance. And it's Giving Tuesday, and we're celebrating and supporting cancer research. Bye, Nancy. Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.